Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. I remember the exact sound the weather radio made the morning everything started to go wrong. It was a steady tone that cut through the low hum of the dehumidifier down in my basement workshop. I had it on in the background while I checked the seals on a storm door order for a client out on the other side of town. The warning at first was about civil unrest in the downtown area and a request for people to stay home. It did not say anything about the dead or infection or what that would look like. My name is Daniel Mercer. I live outside of Springfield, Missouri, a few miles off the main highway, at the edge of a neighborhood that fades into open fields and tree lines. I retrofit old storm shelters and build safe rooms inside existing homes. It started as a side business after a bad tornado season, then turned into my full-time work. I spent my days dealing with concrete, steel doors, hinges, vents, battery systems, and people who always thought bad things happened to someone else until the sky turned green and the sirens went off. For years I told clients the same thing. Prepare ahead of time, because when trouble hits, it moves faster than people think. I believed that enough to build my own shelter on the back corner of my property. It sat under a slight rise past my detached garage, with a set of concrete steps going down to a recessed landing and a heavy steel door that opened inward into a reinforced room under the slab. I poured the walls myself, tied the rebar, wired the lights, and installed the ventilation by hand. I knew every inch of it. When the first news reports mentioned violent behavior and unusual attacks, I did what I always do. I treated it like a project. I topped off the gas cans for the generator at the station in town. I picked up extra bottled water and canned food at the supermarket. I checked the weather radio backup batteries and tested the scanner I kept on the workbench. I ran through my mental checklist of what I would tell a client and applied it to my own house. At first, it felt like an overreaction. The local station talked about a disturbance at the hospital, some uncooperative patients, and police officers injured in the emergency room. They showed a live shot from a helicopter of people running out of the parking lot while paramedics pulled gurneys back inside. The anchor said words like panic and chaos. I muted the television and listened to the scanner instead. The scanner did not use careful words. It just transmitted short, clipped voices, shouting street names and requests for backup. Around noon that day, my neighbor across the road, Jim, called me. He was a retired truck driver who spent most of his time tinkering with his old pickup and watching sports. He asked me if I had heard what was going on. I told him I had. He said his daughter, who lived on the other side of town, had called about people attacking cars at the intersection near her house. She said they looked sick and did not respond when people yelled at them. She saw one of them get hit by a car and then stand back up and keep walking. There is a moment when a story stops being something you watch and becomes something that is happening in your zip code. For me, that moment came about an hour later when I checked the security camera feed on my computer. I have a camera mounted over the driveway and another on the corner of the garage facing the road. A delivery van I recognized from a local company pulled up at the end of my driveway. The driver opened the door, swung his legs out, and then he just sat there. At first, I thought he was on his phone. Then he leaned forward and I saw that his shirt was stained. His hands shook on the steering wheel. He pushed himself out of the van and staggered toward the road. He took about 10 steps, turned, and simply collapsed on the gravel. He did not move. I watched the timer on the recording. 30 seconds, 1 minute, 2. The delivery van sat there with the driver's door open. The man on the driveway did not move at all. No one drove by. The only sounds inside my house were the hum of the refrigerator and the quiet static of the scanner on the counter next to the sink. I picked up the house phone and hesitated. Call who? The emergency line, where every call was already backed up. The delivery company, who would put me on hold. The television now showed footage from Kansas City and St. Louis. The same pattern. People walking strangely. First responders trying to hold a line, then the camera would turn away and the anchor would tell the audience to stay calm. I watched the monitor. At about the 10-minute mark, the delivery driver on my driveway moved. His arm twitched, then his leg. He rolled to his side in one slow motion and paused. His head tipped back like he was smelling the air. There was something in the way his joints moved that did not look right. He pushed himself up to his hands and knees. His movements were stiff but steady. He turned his head toward my house, although I knew he could not see through the trees and distance from where he lay. When he stood up, I saw his face in the camera. His eyes looked unfocused and cloudy. His skin was pale, almost grey, against the dark stain on his shirt. His mouth hung open more than it should have. He did not look like a person who needed help. He looked like something that had been helped too late. I stepped back from the monitor, and my heel hit the toolbox under the desk. That small jolt broke the spell. I went upstairs, shut and locked both front and back doors, and pulled the blinds. I got my handgun out of the safe in the closet and put it on my belt. It is a Glock 19, a 9mm pistol I bought years ago when I started going to the indoor range with some friends on weekends. I keep it loaded but secured. Until that day, I had never actually worn it in my own house. The scanner traffic increased, mentions of bites, officers requesting containment units, calls to block certain roads. Then, one by one, some of the voices stopped answering. The dispatcher called their unit numbers 3 times, then moved on to the next call when no one answered. The weather radio switched from the usual local forecast to repeating a civil emergency message. Stay home, avoid travel, do not approach individuals who appear sick or disoriented. It was about 3 in the afternoon when the power flickered for the first time. Every light in the house winked off, then came back on. The television rebooted. The refrigerator cycled down and up. A few seconds later, it did it again. Every electrician I have ever worked with told me the same thing. That pattern usually means trouble at a substation, and trouble at a substation means unreliable service at best. My shelter was built for tornadoes. The idea was simple. When the siren sounded, you grab the emergency bin, you go down the steps, you shut the door, and you wait until the storm passes. The design is meant for a short-term event, not a long siege. Even so, I had stocked it with extra food, water, and supplies over the years. It was dry, cool, and secure. In my head, I always treated it as a backup in case something like a wildfire or chemical spill pushed people out of town. I never thought about the dead walking around outside. I stood in my kitchen, looking at the flickering ceiling light, and made a decision. I went out to the garage, moved some bins aside, and opened the access panel for the breaker box. I flipped the main breaker off. It is a strange feeling to turn off your own house like that, but I did not want a surge to fry the wiring or electronics. I left the house dark and quiet, took the flashlight from the workbench, and went back inside. I walked through each room one last time. I checked windows and doors, made sure everything was locked. I grabbed my emergency duffel from under the bed. It already had a compact first aid kit, some clothes, a small tool roll, and printed copies of contact information. I added the handgun spare magazines, a box of extra ammunition, my phone, a small battery-powered lantern, and a photo of my parents from the dresser. It was not a sentimental move at first. I put the photo in because I thought I might need something to look at if I was stuck down there for a while. I did not know then how true that would be. I carried the duffel through the back door, crossed the yard, and headed toward the shelter. The sky had a flat, late afternoon look to it. No obvious threat in the clouds, no incoming storm. From the yard, I could see the road out front through the gaps in the trees. The delivery van still sat there with the driver's door open, but the man himself was gone. I could not see him on the driveway or by the ditch. That did not make me feel better. The shelter entrance is a rectangle of concrete with a corrugated steel awning over the top edge to keep rain from hitting the steps directly. The steps go down about 8 feet to a small landing. The door is on the left side, set into the wall, and opens inward into the bunker. When I originally built it, the concrete steps were bare. After one wet season, I added metal grating to the treads and a small drain at the bottom of the landing so water could collect and run off into a buried pipe. I moved quickly, but tried not to make unnecessary noise, old habit from working in rough neighborhoods and from listening to too many police calls over the scanner. The air on the steps was cooler than in the yard. I shut the steel gate at the top of the stairs and latched it out of reflex. I walked down into the recessed space, put my duffel down, and put my ear against the main door for a second. Nothing, just the low hum of the ventilation fan on its lowest setting and my own breathing. I opened the door, stepped inside, and pulled it shut behind me. It closed with a solid hollow sound I had always found reassuring. I threw the crossbar into place, dropped the deadbolt, and locked the 4 latch points I had installed, 2 on each side. Every single one of those metal contacts slid home with satisfying resistance. I had no idea I was building my own trap. Inside, the shelter is roughly 8 feet by 14 feet, with a 7-foot ceiling, concrete floor, walls, and ceiling. I painted everything with a moisture-resistant sealant to keep the space bright and clean. There is a small bunk against one wall, built with a plywood platform and a thin mattress. Shelving on the opposite wall holds labelled bins, food, water filtration, tools, medical supplies, spare parts. The far end of the room has a chemical toilet behind a folding screen. A workbench under the small ventilation duct holds the radio kit and a compact battery bank with an inverter wired to the overhead lights and a few outlets. The generator is outside in a ventilated compartment, wired into the system. I put the duffel on the bunk, turned on the overhead light, and set the lantern on the small shelf next to the bed. I checked the battery monitor, fully charged. I glanced at the fuel gauge on the generator compartment readout. All the cans were full as well. It was everything I had told other people to do. It felt routine in the moment. When I first sealed the door, I told myself I would be back out in a day or 2, maybe 3, to avoid any trouble on the roads. I did not see myself as someone fleeing into a bunker to wait out the end of the world. I saw myself as someone stepping into a safe place while things calmed down. I sat at the workbench and turned on the radio receiver. The main channels were full of automated messages. The local emergency broadcast system repeated warnings about staying inside and keeping doors locked. Now there were new lines. Avoid contact with individuals displaying aggressive behavior or signs of infection, such as bite wounds, visible fever, or confusion. There was a strange mix of clinical words and obvious fear in the recorded voice. The scanner traffic was less organized. Units on the ground tried to report, then their transmissions cut out mid-sentence. There were calls for barricades that never got acknowledged. Around early evening, a voice came through clearer than the others. It sounded like a sheriff's deputy from the next county over. He requested that anyone listening avoid the main highway into town because vehicles were piling up and there was no way through. Then his voice cut out and did not return. That first night in the shelter, I slept in short bursts. I woke up to every small noise. The ventilation fan hummed. The support frame creaked a little when the temperature shifted. Somewhere above, the normal sounds of wind in the trees and distant traffic had vanished. There was an empty quality to the silence that you only notice when you know something is wrong. In the first 48 hours, I thought I had made the right call. I was sealed in, safe, with food, water, and power. The outside world sounded worse every time I turned on the scanner. Reports of subjects getting back up after being stopped, requests to aim for the head, repeated in plain language. Then, late on the second night, I heard something that made my skin crawl even more than the radio calls. It started as a dull thump above the ceiling. At first I thought it was a branch dropped by the wind, or maybe some debris. Then it came again, heavier, right above the area where the entrance steps would be. I turned off the radio and held my breath. The next sound was a slow, dragging scrape against the concrete, like weight shifting on a rough surface. I stood up, moved to the side of the room, under the ceiling, and listened. Another thump. Then a softer, irregular sound like someone shuffling their feet on the metal grating outside. The shelter is buried deep enough that normal footsteps from the yard barely register. These sounded closer and more direct. Whatever was there was either right on top of the concrete or down in the recessed stairwell. I stayed where I was and listened. The noises moved back and forth for a few minutes. Sometimes there would be silence, then another impact, then a scraping slide. I imagined someone slipping in the stairs and trying to stand up again. The thought that someone alive might be out there did cross my mind, but I knew what else was possible, given everything I had seen and heard. My stomach tightened at the idea of opening the door without knowing what waited on the other side. I went to the workbench and turned on the small microphone monitor that connected to a weatherproof unit near the entrance awning. I used it during storm season to listen for hail, wind, or debris hitting the top of the shelter. Now I turned up the volume and heard something I will never forget. It was not a word or a clear sound like a cough. It was a low noise that rose and fell unevenly, like someone breathing through a damaged throat. There was a wet tone in it and a kind of broken rhythm. The hair on my arms stood up. I switched the monitor off and sat down. My first instinct was to rationalize it. Maybe a wounded person, maybe an animal caught somehow near the grate. But the timing, combined with everything else, made that feel unlikely. The image formed in my mind whether I wanted it to or not. The delivery driver, or someone like him, stumbling onto my property, falling into the recessed stairwell, and now lying there at the bottom, just outside the door. The design of the shelter door did not allow for a viewing slot. For tornado protection, I built it as one solid steel panel with an interior frame. There was no way to see out without opening it a few inches. In normal times, that made sense. Now it meant I had no safe way to check what was blocking the exit without exposing myself. I tried to sleep again, but every time I closed my eyes, I heard that noise in my head. By the third day, I was drinking coffee from my canned supply and keeping the radio on low volume almost constantly. The official broadcast started repeating longer segments, which meant fewer live updates. Some of the national stations cut in with talk of outbreaks in other cities, airport closures, and widespread civil disorder. No one used the word zombie, but the descriptions did not leave much room for imagination. I tried the two-way radio to see if any local amateur operators were still active. I'm not licensed, but I know the basics from friends. For a long time, I heard nothing but static and an occasional broken signal that faded in and out. Then, late on the afternoon of the third day, a clear voice came through. "This is Ridgeview Group, north of town," the man said. "If anyone can hear this, we are holding at the old water tower on Hillcrest. We have supplies and are taking in survivors who can reach us. The main roads are blocked. Use back roads and stay off the highway. Repeat, we are at the Hillcrest water tower." I froze with my hand on the radio. I knew that place. I had inspected a cracked storm drain for a client near that water tower last year. It was maybe 7 miles from my house by car, a little more by the back way. At a normal walking pace, that was about 2 hours. In an empty landscape full of infected people, it might as well have been on the moon. I pressed the transmit button. "Ridgeview Group, this is Dan Mercer, south of town. I hear you. I'm in a shelter and my exit is blocked. What is it like out there?" There was a long pause. Then the same voice came back, with a little static. "Dan, copy. It is bad. Town is gone. Fire everywhere. People turned. We have maybe 12 up here. If you can move at all, do it before night. The ones that can still move, get more active when it cools down. If you cannot, stay quiet and conserve supplies." "My entrance is blocked by something," I said. "I think someone fell in before I sealed the door. I do not have another exit. I might be stuck." A different voice came on the line, a woman this time. "If you are stuck, you need to figure out a way to make another way out. No one is coming to dig you out. They can barely hold the roads. Think about plumbing, vents, anything that leads outside. You're a contractor, right? Use what you know." "Yes," I said. "I do shelters for a living." "Then you know better than most," she said. "Single entry shelters are great when nothing goes wrong. When something does, they are boxes. We will keep this frequency on as long as we can. Check in once a day if you're able." Static filled the speaker. The connection faded. I tried to raise them again but got nothing but noise. I set the radio down and stared at the floor. I should have known better. I preached redundancy to every client, 2 ways in, 2 ways out, separate power systems wherever possible. But when it came to my own place, I cut the corner on the second exit to save money and time. I told myself I would add an emergency hatch later. There is always another job, another bill, another excuse to push off backup plans. Now I was sealed in a concrete box under my own yard, with a likely infected person lodged in the stairwell above. Over the next day, I started to feel the limits of my setup. The generator ran fine, but I did not want to burn through all the fuel fast. I shut it down and let the battery bank run the lights and radio. The cells are deep cycle marine batteries, wired in series to an inverter. They can handle a moderate load for a while, but not forever. I started to calculate in my head. How many hours with full lighting? How many with just one bulb? How much for the radio? It became a constant mental background noise, like hearing a clock tick. The water barrels along one wall were about half full each. I rotated them, treated the water, and refilled them regularly before this. I had about a month's supply if I used it carefully. The chemical toilet system could handle a couple of weeks before the waste bags would need to be sealed and stored. I had planned for a large tornado event, a week trapped inside at most, then either returning to the house or evacuated out by emergency crews. I had not prepared to be the only person left to deal with every problem. Humidity inside the shelter slowly climbed. The ventilation system was a simple intake duct connected to a hand-crank fan and a filter box. The exhaust was passive, through another duct higher up. When the generator ran, a small electric fan helped push air through. Without steady power, I had to crank the intake by hand several times a day to move enough fresh air. At first, it felt like light exercise. After a few days, it started to feel like the only thing between me and a slow, suffocating headache. Sleep became irregular. I would drift off for an hour, wake up sweating, and check the battery monitor again. Sometimes I sat on the bunk and stared at the door, imagining what might be behind it. The scratching and dragging noises continued on and off for a while, then faded. That worried me more. If the infected person out there had wandered off, that was one thing. If they had simply gone still in front of the door, that was another. Around the 5th day, the generator sputtered during a startup and blew a fuse in the control panel. It was a simple fix, but my hands shook as I worked on it. I realized that if the generator failed completely, the only power I would have left would be whatever the batteries could deliver. Once they drained, I would be in the dark with only a flashlight and limited spare batteries. The mental pressure increased as the physical space seemed to shrink. 8 by 14 feet is not small on paper, but after nearly a week without stepping outside, every corner felt closer. I knew every small discoloration in the paint, every irregularity in the concrete surface. I talked out loud without meaning to. Sometimes I said my plans. Other times I just recited the labels on the storage bins to hear something human in the room. The worst part was the loss of any clear sense of time. In a windowless shelter, there is no sunrise or sunset. The clock on the wall runs, but after enough sleepless cycles, days and nights blur together. I tried to keep a simple log in a notebook, writing down basic entries, date, approximate time, how I felt, what I heard on the radio. My handwriting deteriorated over the pages, from steady print to shaky lines. On what I think was the 7th night, I woke to a sound I had not heard before. It was not the soft scraping or the low noise from the stairwell area. It was higher, sharper, and full of panic. Someone was screaming above the entrance, not a movie scream, a raw, irregular sound, words broken apart by effort. I shot up in the bunk, grabbed the handgun, and went to the microphone monitor. When I flicked it on, the noise filled the small shelter. A man shouting for help, voice cracking, another voice, higher, either a woman or a teenager, also yelling. I heard a struggle in the mix, bodies hitting something solid, maybe a vehicle or the concrete near the shelter. Then there was another sound, the one I had started to recognize in the broadcasts and scanner calls, the harsh, heavy breathing and strange groan of an infected person. The screams grew louder, then cut off. There was a short, horrible silence, then more of the low noises. Something thumped against the concrete above the entrance again. I pounded on the inside of the shelter door until my fists hurt. "I'm here!" I shouted, even though I knew they could not hear me. The door is thick steel, and the concrete walls dampened sound in both directions. My voice bounced back at me inside the room. It felt silly and desperate, but I did it anyway. After a few minutes, all sound stopped. I turned the monitor down but did not shut it off. Static and faint outside noise filled the background. I sat with my back against the door for a long time, sweating even though the air was cool. That night broke something in me. Up until then, I had told myself I was waiting things out, that help would come eventually, that the situation outside was bad, but would stabilize. Hearing those screams that close to my shelter without being able to do anything pushed that belief aside. I had built a secure, solid shelter. I had sealed myself inside it, and now it was not protecting me from danger. It was keeping me away from any chance to adapt to what was happening. The next day, I pulled out the notebook and started a different kind of list. It was not a log of what had happened. It was a list of every way out I could think of other than the main door. The intake duct was about 6 inches in diameter, running up at an angle to the surface, and opening under a vent cap near the top of the small hill. A grown man could not fit through that space without massive tools and time. The exhaust duct was even smaller. The electrical conduit was sealed and embedded in the concrete. There were no hidden access panels, no secret hatches, no trap doors. I knew because I had built the place myself. Then, I looked at the small drain in the floor under the chemical toilet rack. It connected to the drainage pipe under the entrance steps. The pipe itself ran away from the shelter down slope toward the ditch near the back of the yard, where it emptied into a gravel-filled pit designed to disperse water into the soil. The pipe was 8 inches in diameter, still too small for a person, but larger than the ventilation ducts. The section under the floor was encased in concrete, but the first vertical part under the drain might be accessible. The thought sat in my head like a heavy object. I got up, moved the folding screen, and knelt by the drain. It was a simple screw-in grate. I took a screwdriver from the tool bin and removed it. The air coming up from below smelled damp and earthy, not pleasant, but not foul. I lowered the flashlight and saw the inside of the pipe. It had some mineral buildup from years of intermittent water. I ran my fingers along the inside edge and tried to imagine the angle and distance it travelled. On paper, the idea was insane. Trying to use an 8-inch drain pipe as an escape route for a man my size meant either cutting away concrete and pipe or finding a way to widen the space. Both would take time and effort in a confined area with limited air and tools. On the other hand, the main door was blocked by something I could not move from the inside. The world outside was not getting better. My supplies, while not running out immediately, were finite. Every day I stayed in the bunker, my options narrowed. The next few days became about preparation. I made a more detailed mental map of the pipe path. I knew the original trench depth, the distance to the dispersal pit, and the slope percentage because I had dug it myself. The first vertical drop under the drain was about 3 feet. Then the pipe turned and ran horizontally under the shelter floor slab, then angled down slightly toward the yard. If I could break the concrete around that vertical section and cut out the pipe, I might have enough room to widen the opening to something I could squeeze through. I gathered tools, a small sledgehammer, a cold chisel, a hacksaw, a pry bar, and a pair of heavy leather gloves. I donned my respiratory mask, more out of habit than anything. and began to chip away at the concrete around the drain. The first blows rang loud in the small room, and dust rose in clouds that drifted toward the ventilation duct. I cranked the intake fan for several minutes to clear the air, then went back to work. Breaking concrete by hand is slow, repetitive labor. You strike the same spot again and again until hairline cracks appear. Then you widen them. After a while, my shoulders burned. My hands ached. Dust clung to my skin and mixed with sweat into a paste. I had to stop often to drink water and rest. Each time, I would listen to the radio or the microphone monitor, but the outside world now produced mostly static and distant, indistinct sounds. On one break, I heard a faint voice on the radio again. Ridgeview group checking. Anyone out there respond? It sounded more tired than before. This is Dan, I said. I'm working on an escape route. Still stuck but making progress. Copy, Dan, the man said. We lost a few, gained a few. We are holding for now. Fire took out half of the houses on the north side. You're not missing much, but we would still rather have you up here than down there. Be careful with whatever you are doing. You do not get a second try with that kind of work. The woman's voice came through next. How is your air? Manageable, I said. A lot of hand cranking, humid. Do not let it get ahead of you, she said. People pass out from bad air before they realize something is wrong. Rest often. If you start getting headaches or confusion, sit down and breathe slowly. I thanked them and signed off. Hearing other human voices helped, but it also underscored the fact that they were up there, under open sky, while I was swinging a hammer at my own floor. After enough hours of work, the concrete around the vertical pipe section cracked and chipped away. I exposed about 2 feet of the pipe. It was standard PVC, Schedule 40, strong but cuttable. I used the hacksaw to slice through it just below the fitting under the drain and again lower down. The section between fell away, leaving an open space. I widened the hole in the concrete with the chisel and hammer until I had an opening about 16 inches across, big enough for my shoulders at an angle if I exhaled and did not panic. I took a break and just looked at that dark, narrow hole. It felt like staring down the throat of some unknown test I had built for myself. Once I went in, backing out would be difficult. The concrete edges were jagged. I could easily wedge myself and get stuck. If anything collapsed while I was under the shelter, the weight would be unforgiving. I planned the sequence as carefully as I could. I would take a small backpack with basic supplies, water, a flashlight, the handgun, spare magazine, a multi-tool, and a small pry bar. I would wear a long-sleeve shirt and the heaviest jeans I had to protect my skin, along with work boots. I could not take much more. There simply was not room. Before attempting it, I did one more check on the main door. I put my ear against the steel. Nothing. No scraping, no breathing, no movement, just the slight sound of my own pulse in my ears. I set my hand on the locking bar and thought about trying to lift it and crack the door just a few inches, but I pictured the heavy mass of a body dropped across the landing, pinning the door shut. With the door opening inward, any weight directly outside, especially at the bottom of the steps, could effectively jam it. I stepped away and returned to the hole. I strapped on the backpack and slid myself feet first into the opening. The concrete scraped against my shoulders and hips. For a moment, my chest caught on the edge and panic tried to rise. I forced myself to exhale completely, pressed my arms in tight and felt my body move deeper. I dropped into the vertical section and landed awkwardly on my side in the horizontal pipe below. The air in the pipe was stale and cool. The smell of earth and old water filled my nose. I turned onto my stomach and shined the flashlight ahead. The inside of the pipe extended in a straight line under the shelter, with a slight downward slope. It was not large, but without the top section, I had just enough room to move forward if I kept my arms above my head and pushed with my legs. The first few feet were not too bad. The smooth PVC surface let my clothes slide. The flashlight beam bounced off the walls and lit the circular path ahead. After a while, though, I felt the pipe dip a little more, and the weight of the soil above and around it pressed in on my mind. I reminded myself that the pipe had held for years with the same load. I was not making it weaker by being inside it, although the image of the earth collapsing was hard to push away. My shoulders grazed the sides. Once or twice, the pipe kinked slightly where fittings connected, forcing me to twist to get past. Each time, I had to breathe out slowly, move an inch at a time, then stop and let my heart rate settle. Sweat ran down my back. Dirt fell from small gaps in the joints and landed on my neck and hair. At some point under the yard, I heard something different. A muffled noise from above, too faint to identify. It might have been wind, or a branch, or something walking slowly over the ground. There was no way to know. The sound travelled oddly through soil and plastic. It did not matter. My path was forward, toward the dispersal pit. After what felt like an hour, but was probably less, the pipe took a subtle upward angle. I remembered that from the installation. It rose a little before the outlet to prevent backflow. The flashlight beam showed the end of the pipe a couple of feet ahead, where it emptied into a space filled with coarse gravel. Roots and soil framed the edges. I pushed until my hands reached that opening and grabbed at the rocks. The gravel was loose and wet. I clawed at it, pulling it aside and making a larger cavity. As I did, more of it fell from above. It slid down into the pipe behind me, partially filling the space. I realized that once I went through this opening, there would not be an easy way back. That was fine. I'd not gone through all of this to retreat. I wedged my shoulders into the outlet and began to force my way into the gravel bed. It was like swimming through heavy, rough sand. The rocks scraped my arms and chest through the shirt. Dirt filled the space around my face and trickled into my mouth when I gritted my teeth. I spit and pushed upward. The soil closer to the surface felt colder and more compact. I shifted my weight, kicked my feet against the pipe walls, and drove my hands upward. Finally, my fingers broke into open air. They felt cooler, with a faint movement that had to be a slight breeze. I widened the hole and dragged myself up until my head and shoulders cleared the ground. I took my first full breath of outside air in over a week. It tasted of smoke, damp earth, and something else faint and metallic. I waited a few seconds, listening. No immediate sounds of infected people nearby, no voices, just the distant crackle of something burning and the far-off pop of what might have been gunfire or something explosive. I pulled myself the rest of the way out and lay on the ground for a moment, gasping. I was in the back corner of my yard, near the tree line, under a patch of brush. The opening of the pipe was hidden in the shadows, under a small mound of rocks and soil. From that angle, my house, the garage, and the shelter entrance hill were all visible, but partially screened by bushes and a chain-link fence. When I'd stopped shaking, I got to my feet and took stock. The yard I knew was marked by scars. Patches of grass were torn up by vehicle tracks and deep ruts. The garage door was partly open, bent at one corner. A pickup I did not recognize sat half in the driveway, its hood up, windshield cracked. The main road beyond the trees was visible in glimpses through gaps in the foliage. I could see at least 3 cars stopped at odd angles, one on the ditch slope, another on the opposite shoulder. There was no sign of people in the immediate area, no living ones at least. A shape lay near the base of my shelter entrance hill, just beyond the top of the steps. From that distance, I could see the dark clothing and the unnatural angle of the limbs. My stomach tightened as I understood what that meant. Whoever had fallen there had stayed there. When they had turned, they had been within a few feet of my sealed door. When they finally stopped moving, they had probably collapsed directly against it. I stayed in the cover of the trees and moved along the edge of the yard. I kept the handgun low but ready. My heart pounded hard enough that I had to remind myself to breathe. I checked every window of the house from a distance. Most were intact, though one on the side facing the road was shattered inward. Something had come through there at some point. I did not try to go back into the house right away. Instead, I circled toward the shelter entrance, staying back until I had a clear view of the stairwell. The gate at the top of the stairs was closed, but bent inward as if something heavy had fallen against it. The body at the top, wore a delivery company shirt. The face was turned away, but the build and clothing matched the driver I'd seen on the security footage. His arm hung at an angle that did not look natural. His legs were twisted, as if he had slipped and landed hard. There were dark stains on the concrete around him. He was not moving. If I had opened the shelter door in those first hours, I might have found him still alive. I might have been able to drag him out or help him. Instead, I had sealed the door, listened to the noises, and waited while he turned into something else. When he finally stopped moving for good, his weight and position had probably jammed the main door shut completely. I felt sick, but there was no time to dwell on it. The world around me was not safe. I needed more information and supplies before I could decide what to do next. I moved back toward the house, using the parked truck and the garage as cover. At the broken window, I paused and listened. Nothing inside. I climbed through carefully, avoiding the shards of glass, and landed in my own living room. Dust coated everything. The power was still off at the breaker, so the house was quiet. A lamp had been knocked over. A chair was on its side. There were some marks on the hardwood floor near the front door, like something had been dragged. No bodies, no obvious traces of an extended fight. It looked like someone had forced their way in, moved through quickly, then left or fallen elsewhere. I moved room to room, checking for any unwelcome occupants. Each room was empty. I grabbed a larger backpack from the bedroom closet and filled it with food from the pantry, more water bottles, a basic first aid kit, and some spare batteries. I added a map of the area from a kitchen drawer and a set of binoculars from a shelf by the back door. On the hall table, my phone lay where I had left it. I turned it on out of habit. No service. The home wireless network was obviously offline. The phone was now just a small flashlight and a notes tool. Before leaving the house, I went to the spot where I kept my shotgun. It was a 12-gauge pump-action, standard hunting gun. I checked that it was loaded with buckshot, then slung it over my shoulder with a simple strap. I was not eager to fire it and draw attention, but the extra security mattered. Back outside, I walked to the edge of the yard and looked toward the road through the trees. The cars I'd seen from a distance were indeed abandoned. One had its driver's door open and a streak of something dark down the side. Another had the windows fogged on the inside with what looked like handprints smeared on the glass. I scanned the area with the binoculars. About 2 blocks down, near an intersection, shapes moved slowly between stopped vehicles. Their movement was uneven, unsteady, and aimless in a way I now recognized. I crouched in the cover of the brush and thought about the people at the Hillcrest water tower. 7 miles might as well have been 70 with infected roaming the streets and unknown conditions on every block. I had to decide whether to try to reach them or to find another defensible place closer to home. The shelter behind me was still there, solid and stocked, but now that I was out, the thought of going back inside and sealing the door again made my chest tighten. I turned and looked back at the small rise that hid the shelter. It sat under the same patch of sky it always had. From the outside, nothing had changed, but I knew what it felt like inside now that I had lived in it for days. Every inch of it was familiar in a way that no longer felt reassuring. It was not a safe haven to me anymore. It was a narrow box that had nearly become my final address. I walked back toward the pipe exit one last time and knelt near the hole where I had emerged. The soil was disturbed and gravel still spilled from the opening. I thought about covering it, sealing it, or repairing it somehow. Instead, I left it as it was. It reminded me of a simple fact. I had built that shelter with my own hands, and I had built the escape route too. My decisions had created both the prison and the way out. Standing there in my yard, with a pack on my shoulders and a shotgun across my back, I realized that survival from that point forward would not come from any one structure or piece of equipment. It would come from constant adjustment, from refusing to rely too heavily on any single plan. The shelter had done its job in one sense. It had kept me alive through the first violent days of the outbreak, but it had also locked me away while the world changed shape above me. I took a breath, adjusted the straps, and turned away from the bunker. I stayed in the tree line, moving parallel to the road, keeping low and quiet. I did not know if I would make it all the way to the Hillcrest Tower. I did not know what I would find along the way, but I knew one thing very clearly. I would not be sealing myself into a box with only one way out ever again. The shelter I had trusted almost became the place I never left. Instead, it became the first lesson in a new kind of life, where every door you close might also be one you have to find a way to open from the wrong side. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.